Hello? This is part 4, the final part of my thoughts on Capital in the 21st Century by Thomas Piketty. In this section, he begins to go over some of his solutions, and hopefully I won't spend quite as much time on this as I did last time. And nevertheless, I've marked out a few quotes to sort of investigate and ruminate upon. So first of all, he straight up goes into his idealized solution, which is a tax on capital. Ideally, a global tax on capital, but he thinks a tax on capital just among the largest economies could do much of the work, because the largest economies in Europe and North America control much of the wealth of the world. So he thinks that that could have worldwide effects, even if only part of the world tax on capital. Okay. So he does have some markings and graphs here, where he points out that today taxes claim nearly half of national income taxes claim nearly half of all national income in most European countries. No one seriously envisions an increase in the future comparable to that which occurred between 1930 and 1980. Essentially, we already live in a world which is different than that of the 1700s and 1900s, because our taxes have gone up substantially since then. And even though they are higher in Sweden, France, Britain, and so on than they are in the United States has a lower tax percentage. Lower percentage of the income tax in the United States goes to the government than in these other countries. It is still much higher than the 8% or 5% it was before the 20th century. Now, why is that? He points out that in the past, in the 19th century, governments were content to fulfill their regalian missions, which is essentially run the courts of law, run the police, and run the military. Do nothing beyond that. Today, these same functions command a little less than 1/10 of national income. So the government today does many more activities. It is involved in healthcare. It is involved in patent defense. Right? It is involved in public schooling, and so on. The way that the government acts, what we expect from a government today, has completely and totally changed. And I think, especially in the United States, there are groups who want to go back to how it was in the 18th and 17th centuries. There are groups who see it as better if the government is not involved at all in public education. It's all private. If the government does not defend patent rights so substantially, if the government does not pay for healthcare or Social Security, if the military the U.S. government pays for is reduced to that strictly necessary for a very minor sort of homeland defense without overseas adventures. And various groups may think, for various different reasons, that one or another of these is bad, that one or another of these should be reversed, that the government need not do so much, and that humans, or the people, or the citizens at least, are capable of managing themselves. But there are two sorts of problems. One is that the world of the 17th and 18th centuries looks very, very different from ours. I mean, everything from schooling to insurance to something like the weather report, right? The weather report would now cost more money than before, because we don't have a government backstop, because we don't have government support, because we don't have economies of scale in teaching, for example. And many things the government does to lift people out of poverty or for food stamps, or for something like, again, Social Security or Medicaid. If that goes away, there is no guarantee it will be replaced with a private version. And the private version would almost certainly, I would argue, benefit those who possess the wealth of the country. You know, there's no redistribution without taxes. That's something that he points out, or he claims in this book, is that when we give taxes to the government, there is, I think, some element of wealth distribution to the people in the government, right? To government officers. But we also have the statistic that, what is it, like 3% or 10% of what the government spends is actually spent on salaries. A great amount of what the government spends is sent straight back to the people. You know, is Social Security, is Medicaid, and activities like that. So arguing for the dissolution of such a world is something where we would need to show that such a world is better, right? A world without Social Security is better for some reason. And I think that is unlikely to be the case because, I mean, there are reasons we have things like Social Security and Medicaid existent, because you had massive numbers of people who got old, got sick, and died because they couldn't have health, and they couldn't afford health. You had massive numbers of people who had to work their entire lives without fail and never could retire. You had massive numbers of people whose education never got beyond the 6th grade, in a way that changes how our entire society works and is structured. And today, part of the problem that we seem to be having is that, you know, people lose trust in the government and in how well the government can do its job. And it sees that there are, how do I put this? Incompetencies in government work. And there are groups who are, you know, ready to see the worst in the government at any point in time, ready to see the worst in the people who work in the government. And the vast majority of that, I think, is due to actions by people up top, by the politicians, by the people who manage to finagle multi-million-dollar contracts, by the folk who go visit the Oval Office and drop down bars of gold. And that's what we see, that's what we hear about in the news. And what we also hear about is maybe an individual or department that has problems, is running behind. But we don't hear about the government doing well, right? We don't hear, you know what, the road repair service is quite nice in our county. That's not in the news, and not something you're aware of. You don't hear that our schools are doing great and wonderful. You hear our schools are doing bad. Because if our schools are doing great and wonderful, that's not interesting, first of all. And second of all, it's almost what should be expected. Normal is competency. Normal is working well. But normal isn't surprising or exciting. Normal doesn't get you views. So I'd want to ask, you know, before I voted to destroy the government's funding and destroy what it does, I want to ask, who does this actually hurt? Because if you are some rich muckety-muck politician and you get fired from your job, that doesn't affect you very much. But if you are some guy working in the engineering office or somebody pushing paperwork, then that does affect you. And that takes money out of local communities. And then, you know, we also have to ask at that point, you know, who's paying taxes? Who's supporting the government? Because we generally see taxes as slowing down the economy, as taking money out of private hands. But Thomas Piketty is going to point out that money moves around anyways, and there's a tendency for money to accumulate in fewer and fewer hands, a tendency for capital to accumulate in fewer and fewer hands. So this is going to happen anyway. Someone is going to take your money. The rich are going to get richer, the poor are going to get poorer. And what mechanism is there for undoing that? We have this idea of the meritocracy in the United States, that the capable will become rich, be rewarded materially, and the incapable will become poor. If they have wealth, they'll mismanage it. But at a certain level, it's very difficult to mismanage $50 million, right? You could lose 90% of your wealth and still live quite a nice life. Whereas if you make, if your net worth is $500,000 because of a house you own, if you lose 90% of your wealth, you aren't getting back. You aren't coming back from that very often. You're in much more trouble. So, the effect of incompetency, or the effect of financial incompetency, is lessened at large fortunes. As well, I would say that what was I going to say? I had something in my head. I'll go back to the book now, because I've been on a tangent. I'm like 3 pages in, I'm on a tangent. Okay, so today the government does many more things. That's what we're trying to say here. Okay, and he points out, despite the defects of these public pension systems and the challenges they now face, the fact is that without them, it would have been impossible to eradicate poverty among the elderly, which was endemic in recently as the 1950s. Right? We used to have a family structure where the grandparents stayed with the kids. Grandparents. It was a multi-generational family, and in one sense, that's cultural, but in another sense, it was because you worked all your life, and then you had to go someplace when you weren't able to work anymore, and most often that place was to your kid's house. If you lose all your money today and you have kids, you're moving in with the kids. They're about paying for you. The burden of cost and payment is reversed. And, just on a personal level, is that something you want to happen, right? The numbers of elderly who subsist on Social Security today, who paid into that system and now are taking money out of it and moving it around in the economy, means in many ways that they aren't living with you. And there are going to be some grandparents, are going to be some elderly relatives who do have to receive family support, but that is an economic drag. That is a reason for personal issues, right? If your parents are always in your house and you're never quite entirely independent, it changes how cultures run, and doing activities so as to allow the elderly to keep their wealth, which is what we have, our medical system, which pays for those. One thing that makes me really, really annoyed about America, the United States, is that there's all this cry out against, universal health care, all these movements against it, and yet we have universal health care for those over 65 already, right? We know how it works. We know how to do it. We know how to make it better. All you have to do is expand the system which is already in place. And if you want to sit up there, to stand up on a podium and say, we don't need Medicaid, we don't need medical support for the elderly, then go ahead and watch yourself get voted out by massive numbers of seniors who rely on that. You may have worked hard all your life, but if you get cancer when you're 75, that takes all your savings. You're done, right? Yeah, and maybe you live for the next 20 years destitute because you got sick once. And if that's unfair and terrible for those who are like 75, why is the same thing not seen as quite as bad when you're 25 or 35? There's this idea that you can work your way back up the economic ladder, but it's not always the case. And, if you're 25 and you have to start again, or 30 and you have to start again, 35, you have to start again, you can do so, but it's harder each time. It's more difficult. You're more behind. You don't have this outgrowth of capital expanding. You don't have your retirement to sit back on. You don't have a house you invested in which can grow wealth. You have spent it all just trying to stay alive. And yet somehow the United States, on a national level, seems to think that just because you're old, that doesn't matter. I mean, what's the argument there? That they can't have, they don't, that the elderly don't have the time or capability or energy to get their wealth back, so they shouldn't have to pay. The elderly have already paid their taxes, so they shouldn't have to pay. I mean, but they're also more likely to have medical problems. I mean, there's a statistic, something like 9% of your medical costs are going to come in the year before your death, sort of thing. So you'd think expanding that would be helpful. It's one of those annoying bits, right? That we have systems in place, like Social Security is a system, and I've seen TikToks talking about, well, if you took your money you invested in Social Security and you invested it in the stock market instead, and instead of at so-and-so returns, which are greater than the Social Security, Social Security gets you 2% returns and the stock market is 8% returns. Well, then you would have grown your money. So the government is actually stealing money from you by having Social Security. I'm like, no. The point of Social Security isn't to have money coming to you. It's to ensure that you aren't destitute and broke. You can rely upon a system in place to keep you alive and keep you going, keep you contributing to the economy in your old age. I know lots of folk. I've met lots of folk who are homeless, and they're waiting for their monthly check to arrive, or they're waiting to get into elderly housing, or they're waiting to turn 65 so that they can get their Social Security so that they can live instead of living on the streets. They can go somewhere and do something. And there's this criticism of the welfare state, but it does very good things. The problem of the welfare state, right, is that there are two problems pointed out, right? The one problem is that it rewards those who didn't put enough in, right? They're free riders, people who take advantage of the system. You have a system which costs the same for someone who is healthy all their lives and dies of a heart attack suddenly in one day at 75, or the same as it does for someone who lives until they're 90 and has cancer 3 times. Right? So you have this free rider problem, or why are we paying for some guy who's 25 to have an operation done? I mean, he can work, he can afford it, he isn't that bad. Well, why are we paying for someone who is 75 to have their hip replaced? Right? There's a mental discrepancy here. Social Security is a safety net. Social Security is not an income. Social Security is an insurance. And saying that you must have car insurance, house insurance, fire insurance, flood insurance, because these things happen, and we want to ensure that people are safe. We're going to ensure a level of social security, social stability, and Social Security is the same thing. Right? But if you tax a bunch of people, then that slows down the economy. That's the argument. That's the other side of the effectiveness argument, that, hey, we're helping a bunch of folk, we're building public housing, and that is doing damage to those who are young. But it is also acting as an insurance. It is insurance that takes 50 years to pay out. But it's there. It affects how you live today. It affects how you can take risks. Like, ears plugged up. Okay. So the question isn't I don't think the question is, should we have some sort of welfare state? The question is, how do we keep a welfare state going without destroying our own economy? Right? Like, what are we doing now that we seem to be having all sorts of problems? Or feeling as if we're having problems. The economy is slowing down. It's harder to afford food. It's harder to buy a house. Like, what's going on here? Okay. So in regards to that, he says something very interesting, especially for U.S. citizens. Throughout most of the 20th century, however, and still today, the available data suggests that social mobility has been and remains lower in the United States than in Europe. I mean, so this is directly against what people of the USA think of themselves as. We think that the USA is the land of opportunity, and you are able to move up to social and economic mobility. You know, you work hard, you end up with a good life. Your life becomes better. And he's saying that this isn't the case. He's saying that, you know, the percentage of wealthy folk are generally the same as it was, you know, 100 years ago. The percentage of the society that is wealthy. Right? The American idea of mobility comes from the settler society of the 19th century. The time where you could walk west and stake a claim and grow and live off that, right? Because you had your labor, which you could invest in work, which bought you capital, which was, you know, land or business and so on. And as long as that was going, then you had this constant flow from the cities of young folk or people in trouble, right? Or people desperate for a better life. And they would be able to use their labor to invest in a return, like, you know, land or space or technologies, inventions, you know, that was, you know, good for them. It was a capital which grew over time and over time. You know, if you built a house in the 18th century, and that cost you a small loan from the bank and a whole lot of work, and then your children grew up and they, you know, went out and they had some land somewhere, or they went to a town and started a factory or something, you know, and then they staked the claim, and then all of a sudden, in 2 generations, you've gone from homelessness to every member of your family is housed and able to produce their own means of income. But so that's the myth of America. That's the idea. Then what happened in, you know, 1910, 1920s, you know, in 1850, you know, in 1870s, 1890s, is you had this massive change in the way that America runs, right? There's no more free land. Well, I mean, you know, free is at least as the white settlers saw it and claimed, which is a whole another historical and racial problem. An economic problem that still affects, you know, people on the Indian reservations today, but that's also another book. Right? But we started having in the United States, you know, factories. We started migrating from the country into the city, and all of a sudden, it's a little harder to go up the economic ladder. It's a little harder to become, you know, rich and self-sufficient. And then you have the Great Depression hit. That affects the entire system we run in, and we start having a welfare state, which begins to help. Then World War II goes on, and America's booming. But then you ask, well, who benefited from that boom? Well, it was people who were able to work as the middle class and then invest in land. Today, we see, you know, if you bought a house in the 1980s for a certain amount of money, it's worth 10 times that today. You know, and probably 5 times that in what we would call purchasing power, at least. But now, in our modern society, that effect has changed. And again, it can be very difficult to get yourself out of a rut. You grow up in the ghetto, you go work at Walmart, you take community classes during the night, and eventually you get a degree, you go and transfer to a state college, another 2, 3, 4 years. You get out of there, you're 28, 29, just starting a career. Meanwhile, there's somebody who came out of high school with, straight A's, or academically inclined. Their parents end up being able to support their getting an apartment at a place they got some scholarship to, or just paying for them straight out. They get a hand-me-down car, whereas, someone like me is stuck with public transportation, which, depending where you live, may be absolutely horrid. And, they're coming out, they're making friends, whereas I'm going to college and I'm old. I don't fit in. It takes me 2 hours to get back and forth. I'm not joining any clubs. I'm not making any connections. It's just more difficult. And there's nowhere for me to go. I mean, I suppose I could head off to the oil fields and destroy my health. I could, and that might get me some money. I could get a job, and maybe I can rise up the ranks and do well. But I see many folk in my city who that doesn't happen to. They sort of hit a plateau, a very low plateau, where they don't know how to rise up the economic ladder, and they just, people who, they work at Target or Walmart for 7 years, never get promoted to manager. They're just always in stocking or something, and eventually, their arms or legs give out, and that's it. So I think the generation today, my generation right after me, sort of looks at social mobility, economic mobility, and says it's harder than I hear it should be. There's something wrong here. I hear these stories about how you used to buy a house for this little, and how you can afford a family on a minimum wage sort of bit, or on unskilled labor. Now you can't, and it's so hard and it takes so long. And one thing that he argues in this book is that the economic levels have just been replaced, right? What used to take a high school degree to do now requires a 4-year degree. What used to be work for someone who had only received a 8th grade education now requires a high school education. Now requires a community college education. But someone who only got, I did my school on the 3 R's, and I got to 6th grade in a 1-room schoolhouse in the middle of Arkansas or something. Well, now you better have passed high school to get a job which pays the same wage. It pays for the same level, the same comparative level of lifestyle. Is what he argues here. Right? So you have something in the educational system where if you're poorer, it's more difficult to get a higher education. That's just flat out because schools require tuition. And it's not a tuition that you can get by doing minimum wage. This is you can't get by doing a minimum wage and then taking 1 or 2 classes a week. These are thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars if you really want to get up there. You want a nursing degree, or a doctoral degree, or you want to get a 4-year degree in chemistry or biology. Right? It's not something you can do when you're off time. You have to dedicate a substantial amount of resources to that. And something like, what do I want to say? I want to say scholarships, federal aid helps. I mean, the only reason I was able to go to my college is because I received a whole bunch of aid, and because the college was like, Aaron, you don't make any money. You're poor. You don't own anything. But we accept you into our school, and here's some help you can get. And I managed it. It wasn't enough to get an apartment near the school. It wasn't enough to become part of the community, really. But it was enough to learn and engage. But without that support, it's hard to see how social mobility is going to happen. As we reduce the support we give to education, or as education becomes unreasonably expensive. we're going to see troubles and problems arise because it's already difficult enough to go up the economic ladder when you have a degree. And when you don't, I mean, well, you're going to be working at Walmart for the next 30 years. And who wants that? Just use Walmart as an example. It could be Target, it could be McDonald's, it could be any one of these bits and pieces where you walk in and there's somebody who's obviously past retirement age working the checkout counter, and you're going, what are you still doing? Like, your life is probably not the best. Something went wrong because you look like you're 75 and still working full time. And I've worked with people like that too. And it's just like, I don't want to end up like that. This is, how do I have that not happen? How do we increase social mobility? Well, one thing that does help is economic changes. So historically, what has helped the economy is opening up. Because that expands the area to which the economy acts in. Expands the number of people you can sell things to. It expands the number of things you can buy. Trade liberalization, lowering barriers between countries, or lowering barriers between states, or lowering barriers between groups, making it easier to enter a business. Today, if I want to start a business, there's a very good chance I can order everything I need direct from China. There's a very good chance that if I buy a car that's produced in Japan, that car includes pieces from 7 or 8 different countries: iron from here, steel from here, a gasket head from there, oil from this place that was pulled up out of the ground, but then sent by ship somewhere else to be refined, and then sent by ship somewhere else and made into a piece of rubber, and so on. The world is complex, and if all you have to rely upon is the resources within your own country, it becomes harder and more difficult. There may be a small number of people who make a certain item in the United States or in your country of the Britain, right? But if your competition is the entire world, then it's very difficult to control all of that. Very difficult to nail it down. I mean, what's the major monopoly worldwide today that I can think of off the top of my head? Is probably only something like NVIDIA, or TSMC, and that's only at a very, very, very high level of manufacturing capability. If you're looking for a processor that's as capable as one was 10 years ago, then all of a sudden the competition opens up again. And as for anything else, like computer screens or books or micro recording equipment or T-shirts, the reason they're so cheap is because it's worldwide support. I was talking with a relative about like Temu, and because the US recently shut down a program whereby it was very cheap to send certain things from China to the US, and that opened up, and that system opened up a whole business where you would have people or companies like Alibaba, Temu, AliExpress selling things to the US consumer. And the claim, of course, is that this hurts the US economy. Well, it's more complicated than that, right? It hurts US manufacturing, the people who manufacture those items, because more competition, but it does help the US consumer. It means that this bit of cloth behind me that I got from China is cheaper because there is this worldwide competition. It means that if something is made in, India, for example, it's not just because, the company hates the US, because it's cheaper. And theoretically, then it should be cheaper for the US citizen to buy. If someone in the US is benefiting from cheap items being sent into the US. The question, of course, is, does that harm the US economy, and to what extent? How does this, because, it's easier to invest in like a small business if you can get all your items and you don't have to work with like 2 suppliers. You can work with 50 different suppliers and you can move around. You have choices and capabilities. So there are benefits and costs to all these actions. None of them are absolutely clearly good and bad. Now, there are arguments on both sides. But, okay, here he says, tax liberalization is not necessarily a bad thing, but only if it is not preemptorily imposed from without, and only if the lost revenue can gradually be replaced by a strong tax authority capable of collecting new taxes and other substitute sources of revenue. Okay, so we, in the U.S. at least, and the whole world essentially, lowered trade barriers and liberalized trade, opened it up. Now, if a country makes us do that, it's annoying because the reason they're doing that is we see that is to hurt us. But also what this can do is, if we lower tariffs in order to expand our economy, in order to grow, in order to make things better for the consumer, in order to push competition, then the government doesn't intake as much money from tariffs, and now it has to find another source of funds if it wants to continue doing what it is doing. So how do we work with that? Well, the next page, he says, the major 20th century innovation in taxation was the creation and development of the progressive income tax. The same is true of the progressive tax on inheritances, which was the second major fiscal innovation of the 20th century and has also been challenged in recent decades. So I read a book on this once. There was for a very long time an argument against progressive taxation. It was generally a flat tax was seen as better. A 2% tax on inheritance, a 6% tax on sales or something like that was seen as the ideal, because hey, I'm grew my wealth and I'm passing my wealth down to my kids, and that's a right of mine. That's what I want to do. Why should the government get my hard-earned work instead of me being able to pass it on to my kids? And why should the rich have to pay more taxes simply because they're rich, because they worked hard? There's something seems kind of off there. And we first set off progressive taxes during was that the Civil War or World War I? But it was during a war time period where the U.S. needed to raise funds, so they started taxing income. And it turned out that's a very effective way of raising funds, because it doesn't always slow down the economy in the same way that a tariff does. It doesn't always... You get all the benefits of lower tariffs while also taxing those who benefit from opening up that economy, right? Because the point of taxes is it's a progressive tax, not a flat tax. Then the people who benefited the most, especially from like war-torn expenditures. If you had a gun factory, you were making bank in the middle of a war, but may not have been making nearly as much money after the war ended or after the war, before the war. So we taxed you higher because you were making tons of money from the situation we all found ourselves in. And still, even with the progressive taxation, you would still be well off. You would still be doing quite well. But of course, no company likes that. Being told that you're doing well enough, you're making enough money. And there's always in the U.S. been this push against taxes. He says here, without taxes, society has no common destiny, and collective action is impossible. If we require money for economic activity, money for the government to work together, to coordinate across massive spaces. If the government is a Greek city-state and it involves a few hundred people getting together in a room once a week or once a month and hashing things out what they want to do, you don't need a lot of money for that. If your government is a country of hundreds of millions of people, now all of a sudden you can't just fit everybody in a room and get them to agree. You have to organize them and taxes, money are one way of organizing them. Well, money is one way of organizing them, and then taxes are how you gather the ability to do their organization on a governmental level. So the call for less taxation is, in one sense, this personal crusade that why should the government get my money? But effectively, what it also is a call to say the government should not do as much as it does. And one side of these, hey, the government shouldn't get my money, is often seen and understood, whereas the other side of that same call, that the government should not do as much, is often ignored. Because, well, if we're going to cut expenditures for the government, cut what the government does, cut the government activity, what is that activity? It's going to hurt somebody. But if we ignore all that, if we ignore the cost of massive tax cuts and just look at, hey, the government isn't getting my money, then it looks all hunky-dory until we realize, counterfactually, what would have been the case? Like, what damage are we doing to the systems we've set up? Okay, and then after we had the income tax, the arguments back and forth about we should have it or should not have it. It was taken away, then put back, taken away, put back, in different areas. But today it exists. Today it is here to a certain level, even though the Republicans especially seem hell-bent on destroying that system, at least on a federal level. I mean, you can look at, you have whatever opinion like you want on somebody like Trump, but if we look at it simply through the lens of Republicans, that political party, then the first thing they did once they ended up House, Senate, and presidency was cut taxes on the super rich, and it's undoing that progressive action, undoing that progressive call. And especially here, he points out that is problematic. So if we go back to history, what he talked about before, it's that we had this massive disparity in wealth before 1910 to 1945. And then after 1945, wealth became more egalitarian. Wealth was spread out. You didn't have quite as many super rich, and the wealth wasn't as concentrated. And the poor were able to, large numbers of poor folk were able to rise up to the middle class. Okay, and he thinks that progressive taxation has a large part to play in this. He says, in particular, the evidence suggests that progressive taxation of very high incomes and very large estates partly explains why the concentrations of wealth never regained its astronomic Belle Epoque levels after the shocks of 1914 to 1945. Conversely, the spectacular decrease in the progressivity of the income tax in the United States and Britain since 1980, even though both countries had been among the leaders in progressive taxation after World War II, probably explains much of the increase in the very highest earned incomes. Okay, he marks out Reagan. I have my own biases here, and then my parents taught me that Reagan, destroyed America. Did terrible damage to America. That's the system I was brought up in. And today there are calls for to make America great again. Well, the fact of the matter is, as far as I can determine, the actual fact of when America was great and felt great, from 1945, the 1950s to the mid 1980s or so, was when progressive taxes were high, was when it was difficult to have a concentration of wealth which was too terribly high because you had these progressive taxations, 80% or 90% level of progressive taxation upon the largest incomes. And I think that there is a very good reason that that America has ended up the way it is today because of this concentration of wealth. And that's essentially the whole story of this book, that wealth is becoming more concentrated. We're heading back to the days of the nobles and the kings and the robber barons. And we're doing it with our eyes open, with our eyes open well aware of exactly what's going to happen, well aware of how capital is concentrated over time. And yet there is a substantial increase in the population that just says, hey, tax is bad. Government shouldn't take my money. When in point of fact, someone is taking your money. Someone is taking the growth of the U.S. economy. If you hear news that the U.S. economy is growing, and you yourself and most of the people you know are not becoming richer, then someone else is becoming richer instead of you. Why is that? Is it because they're working harder, or is it because they were already in a position to benefit from the changes that have happened? Were they already in a position to benefit from how the economy is growing? Do they have a ton of stock and we're able to enter the stock market? Do they have a bunch of housing and now we're passing laws to make it harder to build houses, which makes their house prices go up, which means they they earn the growth in the U.S. economy, whereas us who can't afford houses don't, right? There's an ongoing piece here, and it's easy to blame foreigners, easy to blame, the rise of China, but it's not the case if you look at the numbers that what this book is trying to say and point out. And at one point later in here, he says, Europe is the richest it has ever been, but every single country in Europe is in debt. Why is that? What is happening here? Okay. And partially he says it's this rise of tax competition in the world, right? You have, for example, Ireland is famous for its low corporate taxes. So you have tons of companies who have their headquarters in Ireland, but do 2% of their 2% of their income, or 0.05% of their income is derived from Ireland. You have some island in the Caribbean where the headquarters of company JYK lives, and JYK is a multi-billion-dollar company. Or you have flows of money between companies, and they can say, well, no, we booked a loss, and we booked the loss because we had to pay our corporate subsidiary, we had to pay our corporate owner, we're a subsidiary, we had to pay our corporate owner a licensing fee for this and this and this because they have the intellectual property, and our corporate owner is headquartered in Ireland, so they pay 5% on the taxes, whereas we end up paying, our corporation end up paying 35% because we live in a high tax country. But if we buy our intellectual property from this other corporation, which and the people who own us both are the same, then we count a loss, they count a win, they pay a lower rate of tax, and all of a sudden the burden is shifted. So if you're Ireland, yeah, you're fine with lower taxes, with lower corporate taxes, because you could raise your corporate taxes to 50%, and you still won't be getting as much money, as much income from your own local corporations as you will from the 5% of these massive multinational corporations. So you have this constant flow of, well, we should lower our taxes because this other country's lowered their taxes, and now companies are moving over there. We should make it possible to invest in our country or invest in our city. Our city is going to pay, let's say, for a new baseball diamond to be built, for a new soccer stadium to be built, and the city is going to shell out $1.5 billion for this. Instead, and they're doing that because the owners of the football team, the Cowboys or the Dolphins or the Seahawks, or I think those are football teams, or whatever the case may be, have said that, well, this other city on the other side of your state is offering us $1 billion stadium. They're going to give us $1 billion to come to their city and start up our business. Well, we better offer a better stadium than that. $1.5 billion of public money for private benefit, which is obviously problematic. A loan might make sense, but the theory is that, hey, even if we're selling out $1.5 billion, we're getting the benefit of this football team in our city, and that's going to raise revenue, that's going to start up new businesses. And it may be the case, it may not be the case. It's unclear exactly how beneficial that is, as far as I understand. But it's also very clear how you could end up offering $1.5 billion for a stadium, because you get into a competition, you get into a fight, you get into a battle, you get into hearing about this news about it, how it's so great that this company, is going to come to our city and make everything better. And we want to bribe them, essentially, give them money or tax breaks in order to make them, or, give them a license to ignore certain environmental regulations or something, right? Because we want them to it's so great. And maybe it is, maybe it isn't. It's unclear. But the reason why you end up giving all this public money, all this public support to a private company is sort of obvious. You are getting a benefit from it. It's just unclear whether it's the best benefit. And I think it's very easy, or it would be very easy for groups and populations to buy into the hype. Something like raising taxes is not sexy. It's not interesting. It's not cool. But something like cutting taxes sounds awesome, because there's many groups who are very invested in their taxes being lowered. So they're going to run ads. They're going to change the text of news reports. They're going to, hire certain people to write in their newspapers. They're going to donate money to some prestigious gala or prestigious award. And, they're going to donate to a political campaign, and that political campaign, they may donate $10,000 to a political campaign and end up getting $300,000 worth of tax cuts because of that. Indirectly, nothing's on paper. It's just an understood agreement. And the people the politicians who do that may not even do it maliciously. It may be entirely unconscious. Maybe you're just working in the moment and you don't see what has happened. Like, how did we get here over the last 20 years? What changed? And it's, at least according, he says it's taxes, progressive taxes, and it's wealth concentration. It's who's famous, who's powerful, who moves things, if you own a football team, if you own a national level football team, then you can afford to take your time making decisions. You can afford to push people politically. You can afford to give a few $1,000s away here and there for people who support your point of view. If it takes you 2 or 3 years to decide to move cities, and your lifestyle, because you're super rich, is not impacted during that, then the choices you make are different than if you, for example, have a store, have a job, and you have to work every day in order just to survive, or you have to put your kids through college, right? Your ways of thinking about the future, ways of dealing with of that stress are totally different. Depending on how much, income stress you yourself are under. Okay. So he does make a little bit here, right? He says, if the tax system is not made more progressive, it should come as no surprise that those who derive the least benefit from free trade may well turn against it. Okay. So there has been a push in the United States for the past few years against free trade, against the liberalization of trade barriers. Because they say, well, how have I benefited from it? I bought some cheap stuff on Temu, but my job doesn't pay very much. I don't see that I'm going to climb up the economic ladder. My company just closed the entire factory I worked in for the last 30 years and moved it to, I don't know, Mongolia or something, and moved it to China, or moved it to India. Or worse, they closed it and they didn't move it anywhere. It just turns out that they invested the money that they would have invested in my factory in some factory in Japan or Mexico or something. Right? So that the liberalization of trade may increase the economy of the United States. It may increase the economy of the world. Right? It may make the economy better all over the place. I mean, the number of people who have been lifted out of poverty in places like China because of the liberalization of trade is immense, is humongous, right? Somebody benefited from this. And if the U.S. consumer or the European consumer, the peon, the worker, the middle class, the regular folk don't see a benefit coming, then they end up turning against it. And, this may end up hurting them in the long run. But in the short run, it sounds pretty good. And then you also have this leveling of economic realities, which is something that is more complicated, right? There's this. Okay, so if massive numbers of people in a poor country make a little bit of money, and small numbers of people in a large country small numbers of people in a small country make a ton of money, then you liberalize trade. What happens is that the people in the small country, generally speaking, get a little better. The people in the big country get a lot better, as far as economic power goes. That's the theory. And eventually everyone catches up and the whole world has benefited from this. The U.S., maybe we don't do manufacturing work anymore, or not as much as we used to, but we have compensated by that by a bunch of service work, by lots of lawyers and artists, by being facilitators of financial transactions, that sort of thing, by designing the newest widget. Well, somebody else makes that widget, and so on, right? So you transition the work that your country, your area is best suited to do, and that means there's going to be disruptions, right? That means that as the U.S. returns to the level of manufacturing, which is pushed by its percentage of the global population, that the section of the economy which benefited from that manufacturing boom in the past ends up having trouble. So either what you have to do is you move them out. You say, look, we don't mine coal anymore. So all these coal towns, they're going to have a hard time, and their economy is going to go down the drain. And you're going to go from a city of 20,000 to a city of 2,000 because there is no money. There's nothing here. Well, then you have to have a plan for that. You have to say, okay, I understand that there's massive disruption in the coal industry, so we're going to, the government in this case, or private organizations, or somebody, if they want to retain support for the economic changes that have caused this, or economic or technological changes which have caused this moving away from the coal industry or moving away from the oil and gas industry, and you want people to keep supporting that instead of arguing against it. You want people to not be afraid of those changes because they're going to lose their jobs. Then you need to say, look, I know you're losing your job in the coal industry, and here's some training, here's some opportunity will help you move, because the way in which the United States has decided to change is hurting and harming you. And then the United States should take responsibility for that and work with them. And this is also to the benefit of the entire country, because we are opening up economic spaces. We are taking the lessons you learned from hard work in the mines, or lessons you learn from hard work in the factory, and saying that is applicable to other activities, to other work. You are valuable and worthwhile, and you just need something, training. Or you can say, look, there's no way to train you. You're 62. You're like almost going to retire. Here's severance pay, to tide you over. Or do something like, I don't know, we'll give you work in the local library. We'll support the town by hiring folk to work in a museum here, but only folk, and we're going to focus that hiring on people who are 55 or older, coming out of the coal working industry, right? So that you can still survive. And it may not be the level you were at, but hey, we benefited from the work you were doing. The country as a whole, the taxes for the government, benefited from the work you did during your lifetime. And now, because of changes we've made, turning to like carbon-free energy, turning to solar panels and wind panels have changed how you're working. So we benefited from how you're working before, and we're going to take care of you, and we're going to help you. But you can't do that if you have no money, right? You can't do that if there's no taxation going on. And he blames this problem on taxes that are progressive, right? Or he says, one of the issues is if that happens, if you have an entire section of your economy dying because of changes due to liberalization of trade policy, your economy, the section of your economy which does production is dying because you open up trade, and that lowered prices for consumers, that hurt the companies and the workers who were in manufacturing. Then what has happened is somebody has benefited from this change. And he says, well, if somebody has benefited, what you do is you have progressive taxation, so that now those factories, the workers in the factories who are running out of jobs, they don't pay as much in taxes because they don't have as much income coming in. The progressive taxation focus on them goes down because they don't have the money. And then somebody else has gained from that change in economic situations. There's somebody who in the 1990s was investing in wind farms and made nothing. And then today because of their investments in wind farms, is making $2 million a year, right? They benefited, whereas the factory worker who made gadgets on a lathe has gone in the opposite direction. It used to make $100,000 a year, now works at Walmart making $20,000 a year. Right? So then progressive taxation evens that out. Progressive taxation says the person who has benefited, or the group who has benefited from a change in economic situations, now they pay their part. And how do we know they benefited? Because they're making a lot more money. So a flat tax sounds good, but is less egalitarian than a progressive tax. It is less helpful than a progressive tax. It does less work or economic balancing than a progressive tax. And especially, in his section where he talks about the concentration of capital and the tendency of capital to concentrate, a progressive tax is one of the only ways to really attack these huge groups of money, right? These huge collections of very concentrated capital. And there's something interesting here. Okay, so he talks about, he's French. He says, it is striking, moreover, how frequently opponents of progressive taxation, who are clearly in the majority among the economic and financial elite of Belle Epoque France, rather hypocritically relied on the argument that France, being a naturally egalitarian country, had no need of progressive taxes. One of the arguments against progressive taxes is, hey, what if you become rich? Hey, what if you make it? Right? Then do you want to pay more of your hard-earned work to the government? Mr. So-and-so who invested in wind farms in the 1990s and was working on Earthships, and now your expertise is needed to put up this farm of, 40 or 50 or 100 wind vanes in the middle of the Atlantic off the shore of Redway. Or off the shore of Eureka, and now we're paying you $500,000 or $100,000 a year instead of you being paid in sheep and cows because you put up a weather vane for somebody's Earthship in the 1990s, right? Well, if that happens to you, right? If you become rich, you don't want to give more of your money to the government, and the response to that is say part of that is to say that part of there's many arguments, right? But you can say, look, part of the reason you became rich if you're now in wind farms or something is because of government support. And the same part of the reason you became poor is because of government support. The government does so much today. The fact that everything from the postal service to how easy it is to fly from place to place, how safe it is, to the roads, and so on, to, the fact that you're militarily protected, to GPS means that part of the benefit you have today is because of the government, because of taxes somebody paid to the government, and which the government then used to do something with, because the government is very involved in our lives today. So to say that, hey, you did it all yourself, no, you did not. You did not do it all yourself. Nobody did it all themselves. You got a government contract, or you benefited from the legal system that protects copyright, or you signed a contract that was able to be enforced because the U.S. legal system was willing to send a sheriff to some corporate office to start grabbing chairs and executive desks to sell at auction to get your money back. Bits and pieces like that. And there's this also, and look, and now if you're making $1 million a year, then you can afford to pay extra taxes. Like realistically, your life is a hell of a lot better than it was in the 1990s if you've experienced this massive upgrowth in economic status and in income. And so as long as progressive taxes are not too high, it's not really that bad, Whereas the person who has gone down the economic ladder doesn't pay as much because taxes are progressive. And now that they can't afford to pay 30% on their income of $20,000, we don't charge them that. We charge them 3% or 5% or whatever the case may be. Right? And specifically in the subject of this book, he is arguing that capital has a tendency to increase itself, right? Bill Gates is richer. Bill Gates, for example, gained more money after he started working and after he stopped working than he did when he was working. Why? Because he had these massive investments which paid back at 5 or 10%, and it turns out when you live until you're 90, and you quit working at 65 or 55 or 70 or whatever the case may be, then your capital of billions of dollars, even growing at a 4% interest, basically means that you overtake your previous earnings, right? It means that if you're only spending a 0.07% of your capital every year to maintain an extravagant, amazing lifestyle, then the rest of it still grows at 5 or 6 or 10 or 12% or whatever the case may be. And that is really money you don't need to live. So why not tax you higher on it? Well, part of the reason we argue that we shouldn't tax them higher on it is because, well, then they have to invest it somewhere, right? But who are they going to invest it in? They're not going to invest it in you. Is part of the fear, right? The idea is that somebody gets a bunch of money, become rich. We don't tax them very much because they're going to invest in the United States. But what are they going to do? Well, they're only going to invest if they have an investment opportunity. They're only going to invest if they see someplace they can spend money on, which would get them a greater return. And so if they are successful, that means that their wealth continues to grow and grow and grow and grow. Okay? And as it does, one of two things happens. Either their percentage of wealth stays the same, right? Hey, they had 30% of they took home 30% of the income of a company, and they took home that 30% and it just continued like that because they own the company or something, right? Well, then they invest in another company and they take home 30% in that company. Invest in another company, take home 30% in that company, and you put all those three companies together and they take home 30% of that income. Right? But he says what's going to happen instead is it's going to be 30%, then 31%, then 35%. This capital is going to be concentrated. And all of a sudden, you have a different way of living in a society where, let's say I own 5 companies that employ 100 people each. So there's 500 people that own bits and pieces of the company, but I own 30% of each of the companies. It puts me on a different economic level. It means that I have more influence overall, right? If Are some people in this one company uppity, or are they not using their money in the way I think they should? Well, then I can buy some of that and increase my concentration by shifting it around. No, it's not about, it's about concentration of capital, but also concentration of power and capability. You know, if I can say, look, people in so and so are striking and trying to form unions, so I'm just going to shut the entire factory down. And I can do that because it doesn't hurt me financially in any substantial way. It doesn't attack my lifestyle. Then I'm going to do that. Unless, of course, there is some organization or some group which stops me from doing that. Right? So the idea that the United States is egalitarian may be true, but if wealth becomes more concentrated and the growth of the economy ends up falling in relation to the return on capital, then it becomes much, much harder to grow wealth without having capital already. You know, the wealth of the past becomes more important than the wealth of the future, than the wealth of your labor. And that's one of the big problems, right? Because look, I don't really have any huge issue with like Bill Gates or Elon Musk making a bunch of money. You know, you worked hard, you took risks, and you're resting on your laurels. Go ahead. What I have problems with is the generation after them and the generation after that. You know, when I hear that, you know, so and so, became rich because his parents invested $2 million in his company, I'm going, okay, so he's successful because his parents were successful. That's what's really going on here. And yeah, he took a risk, but if his parents had $2 million to invest in his business that wasn't going to that may not have gone anywhere, then they're doing that with, I imagine, you know, the understanding that they might lose that entire investment. And then if they do lose the entire investment, they're not going to be destitute on the streets broke. You know, it is entirely different from, what was it? Like Young Sheldon was a show. My mom was just watching it. And there is a sequel, like George and Mandy's Marriage or something, where at some point Mary, the kid's mother, like puts the house up for collateral, so spoilers, you know, so we can buy a business, right? And I'm like, okay, that's big, right? And in that case, I don't have a problem with it, you know, because you and your parent both took a risk. It's when the wealth concentration becomes so extreme, right? When you aren't just like putting taking a mortgage out on the house, you know, taking a loan out on the house, but when you are, for example, throwing away the equivalent of cents, the equivalent of a few dollars for you, then it seems to be troublesome to think that, you know, your kids ended up so much better than my kids because of a difference of economic status, which had nothing to do with how hard one of them worked, you know, nothing to do with how smart one of them is, but rather to do with what sort of connections they already have, what sort of connections they were born with. And in both cases, this is egalitarian, right? In both cases, it seems the same, but the starting points are different. And as capital becomes more concentrated, as wealth becomes more concentrated, as growth becomes lower, what he's trying to point out in this book is that is more and more difficult to achieve. So that we end up not just worrying about me and my life, but about, you know, the lives of people 20 or 10 or 100 years from now, and what sort of society will we live in? What sort of world will we have? What sort of economic situation will there be? And if we can see a tendency today, you know, just from the 1980s to 2025, in that 40 years, we can say, wait, something has changed. Or, you know, when I was born, there was all this hope in America that, you know, everyone thought you could get out of high school and get a good job. And now at high schoolers are like, there's no way you're getting a good job. There's no way you're buying a house because we aren't building any more houses because the house is already owned. You know, and even if there is a house, there's going to be someone else with a whole lot more money than me, you know, aiming to buy that house, so they're gonna have the cash to give it to it. And if the bank has to give a loan between me versus someone who already has a working business, they're gonna go to the people with a working business. And it's harder, and now there are fewer and fewer people with businesses of their own that they are starting, and bigger and bigger companies own it and own their businesses. And now if I want a restaurant to start, I'm more inclined to join a franchise, which means I end up paying 10 or 15% of my income to another big company. It's everything's already owned by somebody. There's no free space. There's no let's go west, young man, and forge your own destiny. It's sit here, young man, and work for somebody. And if you're lucky, or if you're smart, if you're strong, if you're effective, then you get out of that. You are able to save up. But I could, if I got a good job today, I could save up money. Why? Because I'm living at home and in my mother's garage. I don't have to pay a huge amount of rent. So I could still get a minimum wage job and end up, collecting quite a bit of money, which I could then save. But if I'm one of my friends who pays $2,000 for an apartment, and all of a sudden you're in a very different situation because you don't own anything, not benefiting from that, right? Like I'm benefiting from the fact that my parents went to college and owned houses, and it's good for me, and I would say that it's good for other people too. We want a society which is more egalitarian. We want a society where the rich don't own everything. Or at least I do, because I'm not rich. And then, that's part of the issue. Someone else may have a very different view. Oh my gosh. Okay. He points out all over the period 1932 to 1980, nearly half a century, the top federal income tax rate in the United States averaged 81%. So just that repeats. When we hear about make America great again, America was great when we had high income taxes, high progressive income taxes. It's just the time period they're talking about is when we were a more socialist country. So to vote in a party which pushes Make America Great Again, while at the same time returning to economic policies we had in the 1920s, is a direct repudiation of the message, right? It is doing the opposite of the claim. And it's so annoying to hear about and to read about. We might think the Roaring '20s were great because we read about Great Gatsby, but when you read about kids losing fingers in a factory in the 1920s, or women not being able to vote, or people having servants, or folk end up homeless, then you go, wait, the 1920s was not the greatest time in the United States. If I was going to be born, if I was going to live through a period in the United States, I'm going to pick something like the early 1800s, where there's this wonderful world to explore and grow and move around in and learn new things and find new things in. Or I'm going to pick something like the 1950s, 1960s, where the economy's booming and I can get out of my house, go get an education, go get a good job, and buy a house and live quite a nice life. I'm not going to pick the 1920s. When wealth is incredibly concentrated, when I'm going to my little job in somewhere, just trying to survive, walking past all these giant mansions somebody else owns. Which is, and I've experienced that. There are places I've walked around in Arizona where I'm walking, and it's not the suburb. I'm not walking past, nice little house. I'm walking past gated communities. I'm walking past, I'm seeing, they have like 30 horses in their yard. I'm walking past and there's a brick fence too high for me to see over. I'm walking past and there's a driveway that, I can see it. The driveway's half a mile long. And you walk past bits and pieces like that and you're like, this is so annoying. And it's not annoying in the sense that I'm thinking, oh my gosh, one day I'm going to get there. It's annoying in the sense that I'm starting to ask myself, well, how did they get there? What did they do? And sometimes the answer is they were smart and they invested their money well and they were focused and directed and effective and meritocratic. But other times the feeling is you talk to somebody and you're like, this person isn't any better than I am, isn't any richer in spirit or in kindness. They just had different opportunities than me and they took a different path, and it was partly luck of the draw. Maybe it was just that they learned how to program before programming was thought to be a lucrative job, and they just got lucky, and that made all the difference. Or maybe it was because of who their parents were. Maybe it was because they had oil in their land. You don't know the difference, but it does feel like the United States is changing, and it's starting to be a little more like I don't know many people my age who've bought houses, and if they do, it's a mortgage at 7% or something crazy. I don't know many people my age who moved out at 18 or 19 and ended up with a good life, who didn't already have massive parental support. When you walk around town and you see faces working at the Dollar Tree that you've seen around town in different spots and times for the last 15 years, you're going, wow, they never escaped. They never got out of here. They never even had a chance. It's worrisome. I mean, I can look at my life and say I have squandered many other opportunities available to me, but I'm still better off in many ways than those who worked hard, like demons for years and years and years. They're still. I have friends who are retiring at 35, but I have other friends who hold 3 jobs, and they've worked 10 times harder than I have. But they're still one paycheck away from being homeless in the streets. Meanwhile, I'm one paycheck away from having to ask mom to buy my milk and oatmeal. The prices we pay are entirely different. And it's not based on how hard we've worked. It's based on something more abstract. Something that in how the economic model we were raised in during the early 2000s, the economic view and hope are not really the same. Okay, so he talks late in here about the rising executive salaries and how executive salaries have ballooned, and part of the claim against raising taxes is that all the rich folk will leave, and he's like, well, at least in the case of all the rich folk at the top of companies, that's crazy. The idea that all U.S. executives would immediately flee to Canada and Mexico and no one with the competence or motivation to run the economy would remain is not only contradicted by historical experiences and by the firm-level data at our disposal, it is also devoid of common sense. Right? There is this idea that the people who are paid $1 million, $2 million, $10 million a year are so extremely competent that they deserve it. And yet how many folk have we met in our lives who are millionaires? When we talk to them, we're like, wow, this guy doesn't seem like all that smart. This guy doesn't seem like he's that much more competent than somebody else I know. It's like, how often have we thought, I can do that job? And in many cases, we could. It may take us a few years of training. We may have to climb the ranks, but the inherent competencies of a mid-level manager and a top-level manager are not necessarily that different. Right? I mean, how many of us peons working in a fast food joint have gone, wow, you know what? I think I could do the manager's job. And it may not be, is in many cases harder than we expect. In many cases, it involves needing to know more things than we expect it to. And in many cases, it involves, kissing ass high up the corporate ladder. Seems to be the most important capability. I mean, I remember working in a hotel, and I was able to meet a few different managers at different hotels because I would be able to, the hotels they're all part of a chain that would help each other in different areas. So it'd be like, oh, call up so and so and say, hey, I need somebody to come in Friday, and do you have any of your employees that would like an extra, 8 hours of work, sort of thing. And so I was able to go to 3 or 4 different places run by different managers, and you could see the different levels of quality in between the different hotels, in between the different stores and places. And some managers were better than others, and you realize, wait, this isn't, there's a variability in the quality, but is it really variability on the difference between $10 million a year versus $400,000 a year? The top incomes, are they really worth that much? How do you prove that they are? Not everybody is a Steve Jobs, for example. And there are arguments about that. You could make the argument that, hey, those people who make $10 million really do deserve it, and they really are that good. But I don't know how you would prove it. And secondly of all, at that point, why are you working so hard, right? If you're getting a $10 million salary, you aren't working for the $10 million salary, right? You're working so that you're on top of the world. You're working so that you have something to do. You're working so that you control and you direct and you feel that you're having an effect on the world, right? An extra $10 million salary a year isn't going to materially affect the way most people live their lives. What are you going to do? Buy a second jet? But it will. But having that top job will affect how you feel about yourself. If you get invited to the correct parties, and if you can go to auctions and get wonderful artwork, if you can vacation at Wimbledon, sort of thing. Okay, so then he gets into taxes on capital. He says, but if democracy is to regain control over the globalized financial capitalism of this century, it must also invent new tools adapted to today's challenges. The ideal tool would be a progressive global tax on capital coupled with a very high level of international financial transparency. So in chapter 3, or in section 3, chapter 12, he talked about the fact that there's lots of money hidden in tax havens. He's like, the rich world sends the poor world more money than the poor world receives, right? It can't be the case that every country in the world is in debt. The money must be going somewhere. If you take a loan, then somebody owns that debt. If you pay off a loan, then someone is receiving money from that. If your company is making a ton of money, that money goes somewhere. It just doesn't just disappear into the void. Wealth can disappear into the void. Capital can. But money itself is harder, unless you're burning up massive piles of cash or losing USBs with Bitcoin on them. So he argues that what we need is financial transparency. You need to know how much somebody's making. You need to know how much a person is making, and that they aren't hiding money in a secret Swiss bank account. You need to know how much money a company is making, and that they aren't simply transferring some of their tax debt to a low tax country in order to evade taxes. Now, there's two interesting bits here. Okay, many people reject that global tax on capital is a dangerous illusion. When looked at closely, however, this solution turns out to be far less dangerous than the alternatives. So what is he talking about here? This is page 516. Okay, so what I understand this to mean is that, okay, we are a country, and we have liberalized our economy. We've lowered trade barriers. We have joined the global system of capitalism. And now we regret that. Now something bad is happening. Now money is leaving our shores. Now factories are being built someplace else. Now our people are out of work, and we owe a bunch of money to other countries. Somehow joining this great capital system has done very bad things for us. Well, one reaction to that is to raise tariffs, to say, we joined this global system and lowered trade barriers, and now we don't want that. Now that's bad. We're going to raise trade barriers. We're going to raise our tariffs. Well, what that does is hurts our own economy. In the long run, our factories are not in competition with the rest of the world, so they don't need to improve as much. For example, so in 30 years we're behind, and there's no hope of catching up. And so this is one of the arguments that like subsidies are always better than tariffs. Tariffs are basically idiotic things to do. When you could just directly subsidize, directly help certain companies, you could how I put this, the government could. Okay, so let's say the government wants to invest in microchip making. Okay, the government could raise tariffs and say, if you do not make microchips within our country, you pay to import them. Right? What this does is it theoretically it pushes some company to make a factory building microchips in the USA, for example, who then produce those microchips, and it helps the USA. But that takes a long time. That takes years. And they might not even do it. The other thing you can do, okay, and while you've done that, while you've raised tariffs, what you've done is that all the other companies, the complex companies that need those microchips, are now paying extra to import them, from the world outside. So you're harming the entire economy in order to theoretically help one small part of the economy. Instead, what you can do is you can just subsidize that small part of the economy. You can say, look, we're going to give a grant of $100 million to a company to make a factory for microchips in the USA. And you do that. And then you spur competition worldwide, because everyone has to compete with that, lowering prices for all microchips. And you create some sort of company or organization or a section of conglomerate in your country that makes microchips. And then eventually you have to stop that subsidy, and you hope that the company you have created with your government subsidies is strong enough to survive competition without government support. It may not be. Your subsidy may have been a failure, but at least when you did it, you only harmed yourself. You harmed other countries and not yourself. A tariff is just a way to harm yourself. It's idiotic. It is part of the argument there. So that there are better ways to deal with regret over entering the large. There are better ways to deal with the regret of entering the global capital system. Another thing you can do is institute capital controls. China, for example, does this. Vietnam too. You make it hard to move money out of your country, so that if you have a company who makes a ton of money in Vietnam, and they can't move money out of the country, then they can't invest that money in a factory in China. They can't do it. They can't get the money out. So if they want to build something, they have to invest in they have to invest in a company in Vietnam, right? So that so that this forces investment in your own country by saying you cannot take money out, you must spend it inside the country. Now this has other effects. First of all, it's something I think nobody in the country likes. That there isn't a single business owner on the planet who says, capital controls that make me keep my money in this country are great things. The fact that I have to jump through a bunch of hoops, that I have to deal with some government bureaucracy in order to buy something from another country, that's, oh my God, it's annoying, and it hurts my ability to invest, and hurts my ability to travel the world, and hurts my ability to make a good company. It hurts my ability to move my money around to where it can be best used or more efficiently acted upon. But it is somewhat effective. However, the possible reactions are, of course, if you institute capital controls, and others might do that towards you, right? If you say, hey, it turns out if we put a bunch of money into China, we can't get it back out of China. Well, then companies outside of China are going to go, why should we invest in a country in which we will never get our investment back? So you stifle outside investment at the same time you increase interior investment, which is a decision which may have pros and cons, depending on the situation you were in. I mean, arguably, this is something that the USA should have done with China. Should have done with Vietnam. Is to say, if you are going to enter the global capitalized economy, you need to enter it fully and completely. No capital controls, no insisting upon local control of companies. You should have entered it all the way 100% like we are. Of course, this may be problematic, and you may have instances like U.S. hypocrisy, where you can point at a country and say, hey, the U.S. says we shouldn't do that, but the U.S. is doing exactly this. Or the World Trade Organization says we shouldn't do that, but here's 7 other countries who are also breaking the law, and why are they calling them on it? They're calling us on it just simply because they don't like us or some other issue. There's lots of complications going on there. But if you regret entering the global capital system, if you regret liberalization of economic barriers, then you can reply to that with raising tariffs or capital controls. And countries at various times have done these. Or he thinks, at least, you can have a global tax on capitalism. If it doesn't matter, the race toward the bottom of Ireland has low taxes, so lots of tax burden gets shifted there. Or if you say, look, I don't care where your tax burden is shifted to, you made such and such money in our country, you're paying taxes on that. Straight up. I don't care if you're in debt to some other part of your conglomerate because you had to buy or borrow your IP from them. You made money in the United States, you're paying prices on that. You own a bunch of factories, you're paying prices on the capital of those factories. I don't care whether they're losing you money. That also has the effect of stifling investment in innovation, which means that it is only really effective if you have a large economy, or if it is like a semi-globalized economy, right? Because if there's no place for the factory there's no place to go. Because if we're going to have taxes on capital, or taxes on wealth, and taxes on earning, regardless of where your corporate headquarters is, then one or two things are going to happen, right? Either the company is going to stay in our country and pay those taxes, or the company is going to leave. And if our country is big enough, the country's not going to leave. So again, something like raising tariffs is sort of kind of dumb when you think of it like that. When you could just say, hey, if lots of companies are making money from the U.S., then perhaps we should have a structure where they pay taxes on the wealth they have gained from the U.S. Instead of raising tariffs at her own people, we should raise taxes on those who are benefiting from this situation. That may not be the case. It may be that it's too late. Maybe that, hey, a bunch of companies over in China or over in Vietnam or over in Germany or over in Mexico or over in Canada, who knows where. I don't really know how that's all set up at this moment in any particular or special way. I'm just naming countries sort of random because I've heard them in the news recently. It may be too late, but something like a global tax on capital is probably a good point of view to start with. That's what he's supporting. He says the largest fortunes are to be taxed more heavily, and all types of assets are to be included: real estate, financial assets, and business assets, no exceptions. You don't pay money on what you intake; you pay money on what you own. If you have a bunch of stock, and all your money's in stock, well, then we're going to charge you, 2% on your wealth, and you better sell some of that stock to pay your taxes. Is that fair? Perhaps not. Is that just? Perhaps not. Is that stifling investment? Maybe. But one thing it's also doing is breaking up the largest concentrations of wealth, right? He says it in here. The progressive tax is not a method for government taxation. The progressive tax is a method for breaking up the largest fortunes. And straight up, there's no bits about here, egalitarianism, or it's better, or the government needs more money. It's straight up, we don't want wealth to become super concentrated because that has negative effects upon our society. That has negative effects upon how the economy runs. We talked about this at an earlier point. If 90% of all spending is due to 10% of the population, then what happens? The economic situation becomes very narrowed. If massive loans are given to people with the understanding that they are very rich because they have huge amounts of stock, and then the stock market crashes, then wealth has disappeared and debt gets called in, but nobody can pay that, and now the entire financial system collapses because of an extremely narrow base. So in the interest of dispersing capital, we have a progressive tax. He gives actual numbers here. 0% for net. One might imagine a rate of 0% for net assets below 1 million euros, 1% between 1 and 5 million, and 2% above 5 million. Or one might prefer a much more steeply progressive tax on the largest fortunes. For example, a rate of 5 or 10% on assets above 100 million. And again, the largest fortunes are to be taxed more heavily, and all types of assets are to be included: real estate, financial assets, and business assets. That's the solution he has in place, is to break up largest concentrations of capital. And he says something which I thought was kind of interesting. To begin with, nearly every country taxes real estate. Right, so why is that interesting? Because we already have this asset tax. Every middle-class owner in the entire United States pays, every middle-class homeowner in the entire United States pays an asset tax already, pays a tax on capital already. It's like the bit with, Medicaid and national health insurance. We already have it. It's only affecting part of the system, right? If you own a house, you pay taxes based on the worth of that house, based on the worth of that land to the government. And you pay it not because you had income, not because you worked, but because you own something. So why is it that an asset tax on homeowners is bad, but an asset tax on stock owners why is it that a asset tax on homeowners is good, but an asset tax on stock owners is bad, right? The logic doesn't make sense. There's something missing here in the work claim. Like, is it that, stock owners are presumably investing in something? Well, if they're just owning stock, no, they aren't. If you have your money parked in a mutual fund and it just grows and grows and grows, you weren't investing anything, you weren't doing anything with that. It's just growing naturally by itself, right? If I owned a bunch of stock in Microsoft unless I'm actively involved in the operation of it, I'm just letting other people work for me. And hopefully pumping up the stock price. If I own a house, I'm paying my property taxes to support, the school system, the lighting district. I'm paying, for trash. I have to support my local community is the idea. I'm supporting the schools especially. And why shouldn't a stock owner do the same thing? There's all this bit about, we don't want us to tax them until they sell the stock on it. We don't tax them until they earn the money. And I'm saying, well, why are we taxing houses? Why are we taxing, why are we taxing my mother? Simply because she owns a house. We can't tax Bill Gates because he owns a section of Microsoft. Right? How is real estate, the value of something different than the value of stock? Why shouldn't we tax large fortunes on assets? We already do so. And if you're going to say that we shouldn't tax fortunes based on the stock they own, well, then we shouldn't tax homeowners based on the houses that they own. Right? All those should be taxes that go to those who use it. Right? I mean, hey, if you have a kid, you're paying a school tax. If you use the sewer system, you're paying a sewer tax. If you want electricity connecting to your house, well, then you're going to have to pay for some private company to do that because, we're not charging the housing system, but that's not how it works, right? There is a price for upkeep of the community. There's a price for connecting to the water lines and the electric lines. There is a price for keeping up the fire department and running it. And it's the same with the stock market. There is a price to keeping the United States as a country, as a people, as a society going. There's a price to enforcing the laws. There is a price to ensuring that the world is stable enough to grow without trouble. There's a price to ensuring that the world we live in is one where wealth and assets and ownership and property is protected. And that price, it must be paid for by somebody. Somebody has to pay it. Okay. And he makes an interesting bit here. Interesting claim. Okay. Regarding that idea, how is it paid for today? Taxes, yes, but it is also paid for by debt. The United States federal government takes on debt to do its job. Who is it taking on that debt from? It's not taking on that debt from you and me. The U.S. government is not selling hundreds of billions of dollars worth of government bonds to Fred and Carrie down the street in their in their in their 3-bedroom, 1-bath house. They've owned since the 40s. The United States is selling billions of dollars of government bonds to people who have millions of dollars. The United States is selling government bonds to companies, to other countries, to sovereign wealth funds like Saudi Arabia, the sovereign wealth fund, right? The United States is selling billions of bonds to the families that have tens of thousands of dollars sitting around in bank accounts that they don't need to survive upon, right? And the U.S. ends up repaying that debt by taxes. Eventually the debt is repaid by taxes. Or the other way it can be repaid is by inflation. And in this situation, with that understanding, we have two interesting bits going on. And the one bit is, so if the United States, I don't know how true this is, right? But I've been told the story, that hey, these hundred families own 90% of U.S. debt, and that's not quite true, but there's a point there, right? That U.S. debt is, government debt tends to be an investment. Therefore, it is bought by those who have the capability of investing. It is not bought by the small working class. It is not bought by the poor. It is bought by the rich. It is bought by those with a concentration of wealth. Okay, and we could get the same effect by taxing them. Why is it seen as a better idea to go into debt to the rich instead of taxing the rich? Right? Why is the U.S. selling itself to, putting itself into debt to a concentration of capital, which is injurious to the social structure of the United States itself? We're headed into the terrible future where very small amounts of people own everything. And the United States as a government pays its debts, and as it goes up and up and up, what is it at 7 or 8% of the entire government expenditure is now on its debt, is now paying back debt. And what happens when that gets to 10% or 20% or 30%? When 30% of all government expenditures aren't on Medicaid, aren't on helping its people, but instead on paying back debts it took 30 years ago to pay for a bunch of medical care for people who are now, either dead or in their 90s. And meanwhile, my generation, who in 30 years will be reaching their 60s, are going, wait, we can't afford anything now? What happened? And then we grew up our entire lives hearing, hey, the U.S. economy is booming, it's growing, it's great, we're rich. And we go, where? What richness? Who are we talking about? Who gained from this? What went wrong? What went wrong, according to him, is a concentration of capital. We decided to let the rich become rich. We decided to bring back the times of the robber barons. Why? Because we're idiots? I don't know. Because everything was going, economically speaking, hunky-dory, and then we had this bright idea to cut taxes, cut progressive taxes, and we had this huge problem. And he's saying, well, if we did that, if we change the way the economy works, then somebody benefited from that, and what we should do is tax those who have benefited the most from that. Tax the largest fortunes, because they have grown out of proportion to their percentage of work, to their percentage of effect upon the economy. And why does this happen? Because the tendency of capital to concentrate. Okay, I'm losing my voice. Oh, and then, also he says here, okay, the contributive logic is quite simple. Income is often not a well-defined concept for very wealthy individuals, and only a direct tax on capital can correctly gauge the contributive capacity of the wealthy. Okay. In France, the United States, and all of the countries we have studied, the largest incomes declared on income tax returns are generally no more than a few tens of millions of dollars. Take Liliane Bettencourt, the L'Oreal heiress and the wealthiest person in France. According to information published in the press and revealed by Bettencourt herself, her declared income was never more than $5 million a year, or a little more than 1/10,000th of her wealth, which is currently more than 30 billion euros. Right? And, if I had to survive in 1/10,000th of my wealth, I would literally have pennies. But someone whose wealth is in the billions can survive on spending 1/10,000th of their wealth. And if all their wealth is in stock and they only pay tax when they sell that stock, well, then that means that they can they can control their income. They can control if they make 300 million this year or make 10 million a year. It just is one example of how something like this could possibly happen. And when you can control how much you make and where that income is declared, and you have the capability of doing that because you pay, financial managers $700,000 a year, then the way you deal with taxes and the taxes you are going to argue for are entirely different than, little old me at a minimum wage job. If I'm making $20,000 a year, I'm not hiding a bunch of money. I'm not deciding that, today I'm going to, this year I'm going to make $5,000 because I pay less in taxes, and next year I'm going to make $30,000. That doesn't make any difference at my level. But when we're talking about, hey, I'm making $10 million this year, I'm making $100 million a year, then all of a sudden the price you pay on that tax difference matters. Where that income is declared and how much of it is. So the entire time that is happening, your concentration of capital increases. You have billions of dollars sitting there that are being invested or part of an investment that is growing. Someone else is working for you and you aren't doing anything except sitting there, except maybe deciding to park your money in the correct place, evading taxes, making little smart moves. And, evading taxes isn't something to be proud of. It's a disgrace. It is saying that you don't want to do your part for the economy, that you don't want to help your country, that you are so special and unique, and that by paying less taxes, you benefit the world around you. And the number of people that applies to is, I would say, incredibly small. So that's why he says, you tax on capital. The point is not to hurt those with large incomes. The point is to disperse the wealth of those who own most of the world, or who own pieces of the world to such a unequal level they begin to disrupt the very society they exist in. You get a lot of angry young folk on the streets when they can't buy houses and they have no place to live. Now, he does have some points here to make. He says, that debt should also be part of that wealth that is taxed. If you own a company that is worth $100 million, but you have $90 million in debt, then that company is actually worth $10 million. There are complexities to look at here. There's a difference in, for example, one way to pay off debt is to increase inflation, right? Is to just say, this was argued for a bit, that, hey, if the U.S. government has $1 trillion worth of debt. So what you do is you print $1 trillion bill and use that to pay your debt. You print that $1 trillion in $100 bills, and you ship it out to the people you owe the money to, and you say, look, I paid you your money. This, of course, makes inflation jump to extreme amounts. People lose faith in the government's ability to pay back as money, can't borrow as much, and prices for the average consumer go sky high. And then once inflation starts, it's very hard to stop, and maybe your entire currency is ruined and your entire country is in this horrible economic malaise, and all of a sudden you're wheeling around barrelfuls of cash to buy a piece of bread. So inflation is a dangerous, blunt instrument, he says. So you don't want inflation to go up. You don't want to tax corporations too heavily. You focus on individuals, right? Because that's one thing that's interesting. So one thing I read a while ago is the idea that inflation is a tax on cash holders. If I have $10,000 worth of cash somewhere, and inflation goes up and up and up, then 10 years from now, that $10,000 does not have the purchasing power it did before. I cannot buy as much as I did. So it's a tax. It decreases my wealth, even if my money stays the same. Whereas if I had a house and inflation goes up, then presumably my house goes up with inflation. My $10,000 house is worth $30,000 after a couple of years of inflation. My $10,000 worth of cash is not worth the same. I couldn't buy the house with the cash that I used to buy it back in the 80s or whatever it is. And so by taxing wealth instead of income, you're also pushing for the movement of assets. If you own 7 houses, then we tax on your assets, then maybe you have to sell one of those houses to help pay for the taxes on owning the rest of them. The point is to break up these situations we have. And, the level at which you focus on that, I think, is a discussion to be had. He has arguments for, a 2% tax on wealth over 5 million euros. And I think this is somewhat debatable. Someone may make $1 million a year in San Francisco. That's very different than making $1 million a year in Sacramento, But then, the question arises, at what level does that change? If you're making $10 million a year in San Francisco versus $10 million a year in Sacramento, how is your life really that different, at that level of wealth? So, the exact levels may be debatable. I think you want to set them rather high. If you set them at, if you said, a 3% tax on wealth over $100 million, I probably wouldn't have a problem with that. I'd say, that's a fine place. And, maybe the economics don't work out and it still has a problem, but, that at least has a very clear idea going for it. That those who have benefited the most end up having to pay more because of their benefit, because of their concentration of capital, in order to break up that concentration, in order to equalize the economic levels of the entire country, in order to, free up and make cash move. The purpose of the tax on capital is thus to force people who use their wealth inefficiently to sell assets in order to pay their taxes, thus ensuring that those assets wind up in the hands of more dynamic investors, or just other investors, period. And to do this, you have to share banking information, he says. Between countries, like, hey, I don't know, so and so is worth $1 million according to the U.S. government, but so and so also owns $5 million worth of factories or stock or something in, I don't know, Uganda. And if Uganda doesn't share that information with the U.S., then the U.S. is going to tax the guy as if he had $1 million instead of $5 million. Or, and that can happen between states as well. If you have if you own a casino in Nevada, but you don't tell the people, you don't tell the government in California, then how we view your taxes may be different. We want a tax that is a global tax, which is spread out. So it's not like you can't hide your money. You can't lie. You can't say, hey, it's none of California's business if I own a company in Nevada. No. It is California's business. You're a high net worth. You're a high net worth individual, and you need to pay your share. We don't want you coming in here, and all of a sudden, buying up a bunch of factories in California and saying you're half as rich as you actually are. That's problematic. That creates instability in the system. The global tax on capital only really works in a large economic system. That's what he's saying. In the USA or the EU or something of that level. right? And historically, part of the arguments against capitalism or communism, right? The idea is that, private property and the market economy ensure the domination of capital over those who have nothing to sell with their labor power. And they have a point. There is a point to that. But we don't live in a pure capitalist system. We never have. We live in a capitalist system which is infected with laws and rules and regulation and taxes and insurances over property protections and stuff like that. And as well, capitalism ended up winning over communism partially because money allows a capitalist system allows for more effective usage of resources. It's not instead of being top down, it's bottom up is the idea. Individuals who are more successful make more money and therefore gain more power. Instead of being well connected and gaining power, they are effective at making money or making choices or constructing something or building something, and then they need more money and more power because of that. You gain it's meritocracy, as opposed to you're a member of the party. But as people chase after their own self-interest, that can end up leading to a point where what is the ultimate expression of self-interest? I am the king. I am the country. And this is why would you use the royal we in England for a time? Because to injure the king was seen as injuring the country. The king owned everything. Owned all land is the king's to give away or to control. And that's the ultimate expression that, if you insult me, you insult the country, and so the entire country should rise up against you. And really, that isn't the case. The king is just immortal, just one person, just a regular guy who just happens to be born into this position. But the king is also the ultimate expression of capitalism, right? A protection of his individual wealth, which then, because of that individual wealth, because of martial power, effectively the ability to protect his property and slowly grow his property and overtake and eat up the property of everyone else until he is the pinnacle of the capital system, the top of the pyramid, the owning everything guy. And we overthrew the kings. We tossed them down because that is a problem. We overthrew the noble system because the vast majority of people do not want to be peasants. And when we see the opportunity to become something other than peasants, we take it. So you have this constant battle back and forth between right and wrong and earned income versus unearned income. And one side takes the top point, and then 100 years later another side does, and you have revolutions and laws being passed and so on, and all into trouble. And what's the way out of it? It's not just communism. Let's let the state control all of it. That ends up failing. It's not just pure capitalism where one guy or a very small group of people end up owning everything. It's something in between. It's a sort of managed system where you can become wealthy, you can grow, you can own your own factory, you can own your own business, you can make life better for your children. You can become, rich and well off and maybe, own a plane, own a few houses, but not be someone who can splash 400 million on a yacht you'll use for 1 month out of the year. Not be someone who owns 7 private planes, not be someone who owns 4 different mansions in 5 different states. That concentration of wealth, even if it is good for you and valid for you and something you earned and did, is also dangerous for all the peasants looking outside your high walls and wondering what is going to happen next. And maybe you, as the concentration of this wealth, as the person who has worked for it, is not at fault. Maybe the world you live in is not too bad, but what will it be like when your wealth continues to grow for the next 100 years? What happens to the country? What happens to the system? It becomes unstable, then it falls over. So how do we ensure that we break up these largest concentrations of wealth? We say capitalism is good, but only to a point that it becomes stable. Once capitalism becomes unstable societally, economically, politically, philosophically, then we need to scale it back. You know, and at no point have we lived in a pure capital system without it just being a land of gangs and guns. You know, we have always said there is some sort of tax that must be paid. There are laws which must be followed. There are contracts which must be kept to. There are rights that even the lowliest of citizens has. You know, wealth and money is not the end all be all of who a person is, or how much a person is valued. There's a value in life or in citizenship itself. There's a value in labor which cannot be taken away and which should not be lessened to such a degree that labor becomes worthless. Because if that happens, then those who have labor will not be able to grow and become rich. And at that point, you end up with a noble class and a peasant class. And we've seen that, we've done that, we have lived that for thousands of years. And frankly speaking, I do not want to go back. I'm out of water. Okay, I'm going to skip over this a bit here because I'm out of water. My throat is starting to hurt. Okay, yeah, capital tax and so on. A seemingly more peaceful form of redistribution and regulation of global wealth inequality is immigration. This was, of course, the great contribution of the United States to global redistribution. The country grew from a population of barely 3 million at the time of the Revolutionary War to more than 300 million today, largely thanks to successive waves of immigration. That is why the United States is still a long way from becoming the new old Europe. As I speculated in chapter 14, immigration is good. Immigration opens up the economy. Yeah, an immigrant is taking your job, but an immigrant is also a new person you can sell something to. And, you know, and too much immigration can cause societal problems of itself. But it is a potential answer to reducing economic inequality. You just let a bunch of immigrants in. You just let a bunch of people who are hardworking, who are willing to accept lives of terrible toil, because it's still better than where they came from. You know, there are people who are willing to work in construction and break their backs until they're in constant pain at the age of 45 and their knees don't work. People who are willing to sleep, you know, in dense conditions without air conditioning. People who are willing to work cleaning a hotel, and to get there, they have to get on a bus, and it takes them 2 hours, and then 2 hours to get to work, and then 2 hours to get back, and sometimes they miss the bus, and they're making like less than minimum wage based on the hours included here, and it's not really enough to survive anything more than an apartment, but they have 4 kids that they got to get through school, and they're trying to get into college, right? The people like that who come from situations which are still worse than what we in the United States working today would regard as a horrible job, is a way to diversify the economy. But, you know, it's also something that people, once immigration gets to a certain level, can find disruptive. I think that this disruption is massively overblown, massively thought of as bad when it's good, you know, thought of as a massive societal problem when it is nothing of the sort. But I, of course, grew up in a very multicultural city. You know, I'm pretty sure it's the most ethnically diverse small city, you know, with one high school sort of small city in the entire country. So my views on immigration is that it's always good in almost all situations. You know, if my boss happens to be Indian, that's not bad. That means I got a job. You know, and I'm not gonna dislike my boss because I think he took my job. I'm gonna go, hey, it could have been worse. There could be nobody to work this. Yeah, from the standpoint of the general interest, it is normally preferable to tax the wealthy rather than borrow from them. You know, public debt in Europe is huge, but Europe is actually rich. So what has happened is that public wealth has been transferred, but the public percentage of wealth has been transferred to private ownership. Yeah, the benefits of inflation and its possible costs. The financial system, the central banking is to ensure the stability of the financial system. So this was something that is, we grew up with all the millennials in the United States, hearing about the financial problems. The financial crisis of 2008, 2009, where the U.S. government bailed out a bunch of companies who had done this to us, who had destroyed our economy, who had ended up, causing millions of houses to be repossessed, who had enriched themselves by taking risks that ended up coming back and hurting the regular consumer when the economy slowed down, and whose greed and injustice ended up costing them nothing at the end, as they all escaped with bonuses, as they all escaped with retiring to their houses in the countryside, whereas the effect of that greed by these giant investment companies and Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae systems ended up rebounding across the entire globe and depressing the economy and making life worse for hundreds of millions of people. And it turns out that the U.S. government ended up investing in these companies who had taken risks and should have gone out of business, but they were deemed too important to fail, too big to fail. And you had executives and stockbrokers who made these choices and benefited from that and gained millions and millions and millions of dollars, but ended up not going to jail, not paying a price. Maybe they lost their job. But hey, they have millions and millions of dollars, and it doesn't affect their daily life in any way. They couldn't buy their second jet. They couldn't buy their Lamborghini. They had to deal with a Ford. Oh, boo-hoo. We had to know people who lost their houses and go into apartments and ended up homeless. I know, kids who are like, well, I have to start working when I'm 18 to support my family. I can't go to school. I can't go to college. I have to work to support my family, so that my younger brother, who's 5 or 10 or 15 years old, younger than me, can go to college and he can be good for the family. And we hear this, that the U.S. capital system benefits the super rich. And why is that? Why does that happen? Well, it happens because something becomes too big to fail. Why does something become too big to fail? Because capital becomes concentrated. And this is such an annoying system to have. If capital becomes concentrated, then capital becomes more frail. The entire system becomes more frail. And you have these companies which are too big to fail. And we do not want that. Because one tiny mistake by a small group of people who control the wealth, whether or not they own it, but who control the wealth and how it moves, ends up destroying or threatening to destroy the entire economy. And the central bank, the government of the United States, does its part. It steps in and it rescues these companies. It gives these giant bailouts, but it should not have to do that. We should not be in a situation where you have a private company who has to be protected by the government, and yet is not heavily regulated by that government. If you are too big to fail, you are part of the government. If you are so big in the economic system that the government must make sure that you continue, then that organization should either be part of the government, and therefore under the judgment of the people of the United States, who must suffer because of its decisions, or that system should be broken up so that you do not have a bank which is too big to fail. The very existence of a bank which is too big to fail is a sign of societal and economic decay. It is a sign of a great problem and vulnerability in the way our society is run. The same happens with the oil prices, for example. If we are entirely dependent on oil, then we are entirely dependent upon a very small sort of production, a very small sort of work area. Why is stability in the Middle East so important? Because oil comes from there, Well, we have the oil shocks in the 1980s, which disrupted our entire economy and end up changing the way the country is run because of something that happened half the world away. We want an economy which is diversified and where wealth is not concentrated in order to better survive shocks, so that one small problem, one small area does not cascade into larger problems. Right, and as we have this concentration of wealth, we don't just head back to the times of the nobles and the kings and everybody's peasants. We head back to the times of the nobles and the kings where fights between the rich end up affecting tens and thousands of people, end up people dying on battlefields to protect something which they should not have to protect, to protect systems which benefit people who are not them. And, to an extent, this is the way the world works, right? To an extent, we don't live in a socialist perfect system, but we can live in a more perfect system or a less perfect system. And we're headed towards one or another of those at all times. And as we head towards a concentration of capital, which is an imperfect system at best, there's just a part of me that says we need to be heading in the other direction. There's a balance to be found here in our society, in our history, and we should intake the lessons of the past and apply them, not repeat them. If you're angry that the Federal Reserve had to print a bunch of money to give to a few small companies, then you are angry about the concentration of capital. Right? And it's not the government's fault. It's not because the government is corrupt. It's not because the Federal Reserve, is controlled by the rich. No, it is because the economy itself is vulnerable to the actions of a few that the federal government has to move. So it's not de jure control. It's not direct control. It's not you owe me a favor. It is de facto control. It is I am vulnerable to someone else's actions. That is a very dangerous place to be. Out of water. Okay. Okay. And of course, the bad news is that the authorities seem in no great hurry to resolve the problem, even though the technical solution is within reach. Right? We could have a global tax on capital tomorrow. We could share the economic status of the greatest companies and the richest people tomorrow. Well, we could fix all these problems swiftly. But we do not have the political will. We do not have the political drive. We do not have the political directive. We don't even have the political agreement among our population to even begin to articulate the problem. And that, I think, is part of the issue here. It's not just we can't even solve the problem. We don't even admit what the problem is. Right? And another way to raise taxes is to raise consumption taxes, sales tax. Sin taxes, taxes on cigarette, and taxes on cigarettes and alcohol are on gambling are sin taxes. And sales taxes that you pay at the register are also something you can raise taxes on. But these directly slow the economy. These directly mean that companies which make such and such a product cannot sell as many of the products as they wish. This directly means that every single person in the entire country pays more for groceries. Sales taxes are bad ideas, but you notice, at least here in California, we have voted for sales taxes. I've seen this on the ballot for years. We consistently vote for sales taxes. At the same time, nationally, we are lowering income taxes, and this is the exact and total opposite of how taxes should be run if we wish to make them effective. If we want to slow down the economy, raise sales taxes. If we want to make the economy more dynamic, raise progressive income taxes. Instead, we're doing the opposite. And we are doing the opposite while claiming that we are not doing that, right? We are, the idea of, trickle-down economics it's just flat out a lie. 100% all the way, it doesn't work. It's not the way things happen. What trickle-down economics does is increase the concentration of capital over time, and allows the rich to become richer. And if the rich become richer, the hope is the poor will become richer as well. But that only happens if, as the author of this book puts it, growth is higher than the growth of the economy is, or the return on labor is higher than a return on capital. And as we enter the world, well, that's not the case. Trickle-down economics doesn't work. Even if it appears to work for a short time, hey, if there are more jobs, but there are more jobs at minimum wage, that doesn't improve my quality of life very much. We want our more growth opportunities. And how do we create growth opportunities? We break up concentrations of assets and allow we lower regulations. We make it easier to enter businesses. We make it easier to start businesses. We make it so that those people who own hundreds of millions of dollars have to invest it and use it, which means inflation, which means progressive income taxes, and these sorts, which means inflation or capital taxes. So on. The way that money acts is, the way the economy acts is, it's not about how much money you have in the economy. It's about whether the money moves. It's about if money is moving, and if money is staying still, if money is invested in something and it never moves. If someone owns a house for 40 years and nothing is done with that, and then they buy a second house or a third house, and then the third house is their summer home and it lays vacant for 3/4 of the year. They don't really use it, and someone else could have moved into that house and not had to pay their rent. And instead, they're growing their equity, but now they're suffering because someone else wanted a vacation house. And these effects repeated over and over and over, thousands and thousands and millions of times, end up changing our society. And as we change our tax system to not tax capital, if we make this decision to not tax concentration, ownership of stock in the hundreds of billions, literally, today, we are making the problem worse. Okay, public debt. Oh yeah. When we look at all the available data, today, what is most striking is that national wealth in Europe has never been so high. Hence, to be sure, net public wealth is virtually zero, given the size of the public debt. But net private wealth is so high, the sum of the two is as great as it has been in a century. Hence, the idea that we are about to bequeath a shameful burden of debt to our children and grandchildren, and that we ought to wear sackcloth and ashes and beg for forgiveness simply makes no sense. The nations of Europe have never been so rich. What is true and shameful, on the other hand, is that this vast national wealth is very unequally distributed. Private wealth rests on public poverty. And one particularly unfortunate consequence of this is that we currently spend far more in interest on the debt than we invest in higher education. Right? Look, if we're going to pay interest on a debt, why on earth are we doing that? What we should do, he argues, is tax the people, is tax the ultra-rich, and then spend that money on the lower levels so that they can grow, so that the entire economy can grow, right? If we're spending more money on servicing the public, 7% of our GDP, right? We're spending more money on servicing our public debt than we are in education, which means that we are spending money investing in the future, okay? And yet we have more investment going to those people who buy bonds than those people who need to than the young people who are going to college or who could have gone to college if we had helped them. Right? This is the exact opposite. We spend money servicing public debt, helping to increase the concentration of wealth, instead of spending that instead of taxing that wealth and spending that same money, making that same investment, because we are spending the money on the future of our children, for example, right? We don't do that. Instead, we're helping those who are already rich, instead of helping those who are poor and could become rich. Which is a worrisome place to be. Okay. If democracy is someday to regain control of capitalism, it must start by recognizing the concrete institutions in which democracy and capitalism are embodied need to be reinvented again and again. We do not live in a perfect world, and we can make it more perfect. We can improve, and this means sometimes we'll make mistakes, but this also means that we can look back at what we've done and recognize that we have made mistakes, and we need to do the opposite now. Right? We don't want to repeat the mistakes of the past. We want to make new mistakes. We do not want to repeat the mistakes of the past. We want to make new mistakes. Okay, so his conclusion. The overall conclusion of this study is that a market economy based on private property, if left to itself, contains powerful forces of convergence, associated in particular with the diffusion of knowledge and skills, but it also contains powerful forces of divergence, which are potentially threatening to democratic societies, to the values of social justice on which they are based. A market economy based on private property, which we have now, does allow for the dissemination of knowledge and skills and technology. But it also means that ownership becomes more concentrated over time. Okay? And these forces are in direct competition. Growth is in the growth of the economy is in competition with the growth of capital, and one or the other of those is going to be higher at any particular time. And you want the growth of the economy to be higher than the growth of capital, because the growth of the economy being better than the return on investing in the economy in general, being better than return on just owning capital, means that work does something, means that work improves your life, means that by working hard, you receive more than if you did not work hard. And we do not want the opposite way around, right? We don't want it to be such that just because your parents or grandparents are rich, you are rich today, and just because my parents or grandparents were poor means that I, in the future, am also going to be poor. Well, we want the fact that you are wealthy and powerful and respected in society to mean something about who you are and how you work, not mean that your parents or your grandparents or someone before you worked hard. It's what have you done today? And this doesn't mean that we need to do away with all inheritance. This doesn't mean that we need to start everybody out at the same exact level. But this does mean that if we want everyone to stay within eyesight of each other, it's not about making people all be at the same level and start out and everyone gets $100,000 when they turn 18 and that's the only support they ever get from the state. Blah. And you can't give your inheritance to anybody. That's an entirely separate system, which may have its own problems, to say the least. But the system we are in today also has problems of classism. And how do we know that? Because the history of the world is private property. The history of the world is control in the hands of individuals. Even if the state owns everything, the state is embodied in the people who make decisions for the state. And ownership of property is not about ownership, it is about control. It is about direction. And that has remained the same ever since we had priest kings. One person or one small group determines what the vast majority of people do. And today, the hope of democracy is the opposite, right? That as the population of the entire country, as the ones who are alive right now, we can change the Constitution, we can rewrite the laws, we can enforce rights, we can determine that one small group is not discriminated against, and yet also cannot discriminate against another. You know? As he puts it here, once constituted, capital reproduces itself faster than output decreases. The past devours the future. We do not want the past to devour the future. We do not want to go back. We want to go forward. We want to look at when America was great and ask, what made it great? What was the case? What did we do? Not how has the world changed, but in a more Stoic sense, in a more sense. I've been reading Marcus Aurelius, right? What do we control? We don't control China and Europe and how they act. What we control is how we act, how we tax, how we invest. And instead of blaming the foreigner or blaming the immigrant, we should instead be looking and deciding about ourselves and the choices we have made and why have we made those choices. And if they didn't end up how we thought they would, if a liberalization of the economy didn't benefit us as we thought it would, then it's not the fault of China, or Vietnam or Germany. It's the fault of us more than anything else. You know, this personal responsibility the United States has to take for its own problems is something we are still struggling to deal with. It's easy to blame someone else, easy to blame another group when we are the people living, you know? And don't let the past devour the future. Don't simply become another cog in the machine of fate and destiny. We are alive, they are dead. No, you can't go back and yet at the same time, we do want to learn from the future. I mean, we do want to learn from the past. We do want to learn from what happened. We do want to look at when our country was greater and say, what changed? And partially it was the world outside, but it was also us. It was also the way we decided to run our own country and what we decided was important. And we took actions that led us to where we are today. And if you are happy with the world you live in, if you see no problem in how wealth is distributed, if you see no issue with economic opportunity for you or your progeny or your friends, in the way the world is right now, then you don't have to listen to me. You don't have to listen to this book. You don't have to listen to any of this. You seem perfectly happy. You know what you're doing. You know your life. Live with it. You know, you seem to be, you're just fine. But if you're angry, if you're annoyed, if you're someone who voted for those who were outside the establishment, then act, well, then ask, I say. Why did you vote for someone who was outside the establishment? And are they actually outside the establishment? And are they making the right choices? You know, if you voted for someone who promised something and they never did it, if someone said, we're going to make it easier to build houses and they never did, if someone who said, we're going to make the country safer and instead they made guns easier to get, you know, someone who said, we're going to make it so that you can invest in the United States and so that the economy will turn around, but then they lowered taxes on the ultra rich. If you're talking about someone who said, well, we need to build a train from city A to city B and it'll be great and it'll be easy and it'll cost only this much and we'll have it done quickly. And then 20 years later, they built 20 miles of track. Then ask, who am I voting for? What is going on? Who are these people? Why have they failed so much? And Is it them or is it us? Is it who we have voted for and what we have tried to do for the past 40 or so years? Or, it's just what is happening here? How do we gain a clear idea and not just looking at the latest news bit from today, but thinking back at our own history and our own knowledge and our own experiences and getting to the bottom of what's going on by looking at more objective and more scientific facts, listening to those who have studied the problem, not listening to those who have something to benefit from getting your support. Because someone who benefits from your support will say whatever the hell they want to in order to get you on their side, and then they will lie and cheat and betray and make it seem as if they were doing good when really they did nothing of the sort, because it benefits them. So ask yourself, who does not benefit from a change they're asking for? And those are the ones I would think you would want to listen to. And then ask yourself, okay, they don't benefit from this change, but would I? And then you decide whether you support them or not. Someone may say, I want to change the world in such and such a way, and they may not benefit from that, but it may make the world worse in every way for everybody. Or someone may say, I want to change the world in this certain way, and I will benefit from that, but so will you. And that's a much more suspicious place to be in. Right? But it is less suspicious than the situation where someone stands up and says, support me and I will make life better for you. And doesn't mention themselves at all. Well, if you're not mentioning yourself at all, then what's going on here? You're not, if I say, I want to make life better for you, but I don't say that either it's going to be better for me or that I'm not benefiting from it at all, then what's happening is I am trying to hide the fact that I'm benefiting from this change more than you are. That I'm taking advantage of you and I'm growing faster. Why do people say what they say? Why do people draw the conclusions they draw? Why do people promise what they promise? And what are the actual actions they take? And historically, what has been the case? And are we repeating the mistakes of the past, or are we trying to learn from them? And as regards money, I'm just going to end by repeating the ending lines of this book. Because that's the lesson of this book, I think, is that there are changes happening in society, and if we do not pay attention to them, we will be overtaken by them. Yet it seems to me that all social scientists, all journalists and commentators, all activists in the unions and in politics of whatever stripe, and especially all citizens, should take a serious interest in money, its measurements, the facts surrounding it, and its history. Those who have a lot of it will never fail to defend their interests. Refusing to deal with numbers rarely serves the interests of the least well off. We, in our normal everyday lives, are concerned with ourselves and look at our little section of the world as if it is the most important section of the entire system, but it is rarely so. Those with more power and wealth also act in the same way. And in doing so, both of us end up causing damage to the collaborative society we exist in. We end up going to war and fighting each other in this zero-sum game, and seeing it as a zero-sum game because of our actions, when really there is a way for us all to benefit. Really, there's a way for us all to become, if not rich, at least better off, happier, safer, in an economic system that is more diverse and that benefits meritocracy, benefits abilities based on what you do, not on what someone else does for you. We don't want to destroy wealth and riches. We want there to be that reward. We want there to be a desire for yachts and first-class tickets on airplanes and vacations. We want there to be that high life. We want there to be the capability for people to take a year or two off of work and focus on becoming an artist or an intellectual or going to school. You know, we want these disparities in wealth because it gives us something to aim for. You know, it gives us, I want a bigger house. I want a bigger car. You know, I want to go to New York and see some shows on Broadway. You know, and if I work hard, I can get there. But we do not also want it to be the case that even if I work hard, I can never get there. There is a balance to be found in the distribution of riches, that poor and hardworking be not so poor, and rich and hardworking be not quite so rich.